here's what's fascinating about Hebrews, and we're doing a book with no author, and I don't mean that there is no one that wrote it, which we just don't know who the author is, and lots of time is spent on this by the theology people among us. And I remember I was in seminary, and I had to, for one of my papers, I actually had to do a paper on the authorship of Hebrews, and so I did this deep dive on it. And so I was looking at my notes on that in preparation for this, and so here's the way. This was my college argument. This was undergrad. Okay, this is what I came up with. Basically, I focused on the fact that the style of Greek, so New Testament's written in Greek. The style of Greek in the book of Hebrews is very elegant. In fact, I've lost all Greek that I learned. I took a couple of classes in college, but those who know Greek really well and biblical Greek would say it's the best Greek in the New Testament. Okay, meaning the stylistic nature of this book is different than other books, and it's notable of how it's written. A lot of people would say that there's a Greek influence of an early Jewish philosopher, a guy named Philo, that you can find throughout the book. Philo, so this guy, he was from a city called Alexandria. Now, why am I telling you all this? Because there's this verse in Acts, okay, not in Hebrews. There's a verse in Acts. This is about the early church. And I remember reading this verse and I was like, this puts it all together. In Acts 18, verse 24 says this: Meanwhile, a Jew named Apollos, an eloquent speaker who knew the scriptures well, had arrived in Ephesus from Alexandria in Egypt. Now, this is NLT, is what we're going to be using throughout the podcast. Other versions point out, not that he was coming from Alexandria, but that he was from Alexandria. So we had a few interesting things here. We know that this is an eloquent speaker. Okay, so Apollos' Greek would have been eloquent, would have matched what we find in the writing style. Knows the scriptures well, as we're going to see tons of Old Testament references in the book of Hebrews. So it's almost like an Old Testament book got plunged into the New Testament. There's so much Old Testament references here. And then the connection to Philo, Apollos is from the same city Philos is from. Philos from. And so I remember reading this and I was like, this is open and shut. This is Apollos. Of course, Apollos wrote this. That was me in seminary. I still think there's a good argument to be made for that. But if you go on a couple verses, there's another great argument in the book of Acts. And so I read Acts 18:24. If you go 2 verses later, you find another person. And a lot of people today would say it's this person. It's a woman named Priscilla. And so Acts 18:26, just 2 verses later, says this: When Priscilla and Aquila, her husband, heard Apollos preaching boldly in the synagogue, they took him aside and explained the way of God even more accurately. So here you have a woman and her husband who hear Apollos preaching, this very eloquent speaker who already knew the scriptures well, and they even go further. Like, hey, we're going to help you understand more than you understand. And so I love the theory of the book of Hebrews being written by a female, because it would make absolute sense. How come we don't know who wrote it? Well, if it was Priscilla, there's no way a female would have, in that culture, the ability to put her name on this and get any credibility. And so it would have to be this anonymous letter. And so I think my heart wants it to be Priscilla. And because intellectually I could say, hey, I think Apollos and Priscilla both have really compelling arguments, my heart is going to choose Priscilla. So I want to hear, what's the skeptic take, Jeff? You've heard my arguments. Who is it? Who wrote this book?
Well, first off, I just want to say the Apostle Paul is rolling in his grave right now at the thought of letting a woman write a book of the New Testament.
I thought you were saying because a lot of people think Paul wrote it, and if you study this, people who study it don't think Paul wrote it. But yeah, he might be rolling his grave because he lost credit for a book that he had credit for. But for sure, if it was Priscilla, this might be a real tough pill for him.